Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight the change makers we're talking with are from NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia. Joining us this evening is Tarina Keene, the Executive Director, Michelle Woods, Communications Director, and Galina Valchina, Policy Director. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having us, Catherine.
So we're like 2 weeks away from a very important election. Every time I do the show, I remind people that November 5th is Election Day in Virginia, lest anyone should forget how important these elections are. It is our Senate, it is our House, and it is a tremendous number of local offices as well. But tonight we're going to be talking about what hangs in the balance when it comes to the access of women in Virginia to reproductive health care services and the unbelievable assault that's taking place from the federal legislature to state legislatures across the country and our Supreme Court. And probably the biggest threat right now to Roe v. Wade is, in fact, the two appointees to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. So, Tarina, give us a little bit of background about how NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia started. You've been executive director now for, 10 years?
Almost 12, actually.
Oh, my goodness gracious. Time flies.
Yes. Well, NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia is the policy and political leader of the reproductive rights movement in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have over 22,000 activists that we call upon regularly to take action when it comes to making sure that the General Assembly hears from us, that we hold them accountable, and we let them know what's at stake for women's reproductive rights and health care. And also, we do the same thing during election year. So they go hand in hand when it comes to policy and elections. And I would say that this year is probably, at least during my tenure, I'm a lifelong Virginian as well. I've seen some real differences happen over the last decade, and actually over my lifetime, around how politics are playing out right now. And I would say there's a part of me that's very excited and also terrified about what is at stake. We've known, NARAL's been on the front lines for a very long time. Our organization is about 17 years old, and we have, every day during that time have been making sure that we are standing up for real access, real tangible access to reproductive health and rights. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the years with the laws that have been passed and put on the books is that we don't actually have a lot of people who live here in the Commonwealth don't have real tangible access to exercising their constitutional rights based on maybe their income level, their location in the Commonwealth, especially rural women, young women, women of color. It is much harder to access. And the laws that have been enacted in the Commonwealth have made that even harder. But we have an opportunity this year with the election that is coming up to actually change all of that. And we're getting up every day, 7 days a week. We have 11 days left until November 5th. We are knocking on doors. We are making phone calls. We're sending text messages. And we're sending mail. And we want every Virginian to understand what is at stake when it comes to protecting your constitutional right to decide if, when, with whom to have a family or start a family or to expand your family. That is something that I think every Virginian, every American holds dear to themselves to be able to decide when and if to have a child.
I agree with you. And, back in 1972, it was interesting because since that time, state legislatures have chipped away at Roe, not by trying to necessarily directly overturn it, although I think that's a real threat now, but simply chipping away at access. So the trap laws here in Virginia, the targeted regulations against abortion providers, really was intended to basically shut down clinics without necessarily overturning any laws. You are just regulating access out of existence.
Yes.
And so, I know that NARAL has fought the good fight. Has fought the good
We're
fight.
still fighting.
You are, and there were some court cases very recently, and there were some a little bit of traction and not enough, and just not enough. And so, flipping the House and the Senate this year would get traction where it needs to be in eradicating these nonsensical. Really, some of these are very nonsensical sorts of regulations that are meant to be two things: a way of placing hurdles, especially for low-income women, and stigmatizing the whole process of seeking abortion care. And so I'm gonna kick it over to Michelle to talk for a minute about how you are messaging in this election year. There's a lot of people. I think that there's a statistic that says 1 in 3 women have actually accessed abortion services in their life, which means that in any large room full of women, there are women who have had an abortion and simply do not share that, do not talk about that. There's a tremendous amount of stigma around the word, around the concept, around who has abortions and why. So what have you found as far as trying to message this election year?
Well, one thing that we found that's consistent with years past is that 7 in 10 Virginians support access to safe and legal abortion, and they don't want politicians interfering with that right. And that's been consistent in years past. We've seen reproductive rights be a top issue for voters among access to high-quality health care, a lot of talk about gun violence prevention, as you know, this year, but reproductive rights for sure. And the stakes couldn't be higher for reproductive rights and freedom in Virginia, as you mentioned, based on the threat to the Supreme Court and them trying to gut Roe as we know it. But we have a real opportunity here in Virginia this year to make sure that we deliver that access and preserve and protect access to safe and legal abortion. And we know that voters want to elect candidates who trust a woman to make her own reproductive health care decisions, and they don't want to see what's going on all across the South and in other states controlled by anti-choice, often Republican politicians who, as you probably saw this year in Georgia and Alabama, have implemented extreme bans on abortion. They have signed into law bans on abortion before a woman even knows that she's pregnant, as you've probably seen in Georgia. And that is a huge turnoff to Virginia voters. And they know that if given the chance, anti-choice politicians here in Virginia would follow the same suit as has been done down south in Alabama and Georgia. And they don't want to see that happen. So Virginians know that they need to get out and vote once again for pro-choice candidates across the state. And we have a real opportunity, if we're able to vote in and flip the chambers in the House and the Senate, we'll be able to have a pro-choice majority for the first time in history. We have a pro-choice governor, a pro-choice lieutenant governor. And that means that if we're able to pass reproductive rights legislation and protect access to safe and legal abortion in Virginia, then we don't necessarily have to rely on the federal government or worry about what the courts are doing if we're able to secure that right here in Virginia.
For those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I am your host, Catherine Reed, and we are speaking with the dynamic trio from NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia. That's Tarina Keene, Executive Director, Michelle Woods, the Communications Director, and Galina Valchina, who is the Policy Director. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and you are listening to Radio Fairfax. I want to ask Galina a question because Galina is actually the boots on the ground in Richmond. So there's an ongoing year-round effort to impact legislation, but during the legislative session, that is where, Galina, I believe you really kick it into high gear, actually calling on individual legislators, and trying to, pull together a coalition of legislators, because I think there is strength in numbers, and the more legislators you can get to commit, the more momentum you gain in trying to hold on to a majority or create a majority.
Absolutely, that's absolutely true. And luckily for us, um, from my experience from the last 2 years, the legislators, who are Democratic legislators, have been very open about abortion and have been supportive of the issue. And we're hoping that we'll elect a pro-choice majority. So all the legislators that we have endorsed, all the incumbents and all the folks that we've endorsed are obviously pro-choice, and provided we get them all in, we'll have a very strong pro-choice majority. I'm not sure if there was a question in there.
Well, I guess the question too is, like, when you go to each legislator, are you helping them to understand the specifics of the policy changes that you're asking for? Do you help them to message around what NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia is supporting as far as legislative changes, legislative protections, or defenses against bad bills?
Oh, sure, absolutely. We do. I do all of that, and with our wonderful staff, and we have, amazing volunteers and advocates who come out with me, and we also have providers who chime in as well to help legislators understand some of the nuance about some of the legislative changes that we want to to ask for, to help them draft statutes or draft bills that will do the most good for the most people, and also obviously help them message those bills and explain them to their constituents. And that's obviously where Michelle comes in, and where my team comes in. The most important thing is to remember and remind legislators over and over again that we can no longer rely on the courts to do the work for us, right? We used to be able to rely on the courts to help us out in terms of moving rights forward, in terms of protecting rights to abortion, and granted, the courts have chipped away in some ways, the Supreme Court has, but now we are at an impasse, at a point where we have a very conservative Supreme Court. Thank you to Gorsuch and
Kavanaugh. Oh my goodness, Kavanaugh.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court is not going to help us out, right? We know that there are cases that are rolling up, including the most recent Louisiana case that the Supreme Court took on October 4th, right, where we know that this further chipping away at Roe is coming on the federal level. And we know that this administration is not exactly friendly to abortion, so to speak, to say it mildly. And we don't know what will happen with the federal legislature.
And
right?
again,
So
and that's why it matters. It matters so much at the state level, because there are states that I believe that have encoded protections, some of them in their constitution. I don't think we're close to doing that in Virginia. We have a complicated methodology for amending our constitution, but I do think there are some states that have taken that proactive step of saying, regardless of what the federal government does, there are federal powers and there are states that have certain powers, and so they've gone that extra step. In a world where we could wave a magic wand, I think all of us on this show tonight would say that would be an ideal goal, is to get a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and have a governor over the I think it's 3 years, isn't it, Tarina? Is it 3 years it takes to amend the Constitution?
For a constitutional amendment, well, the process is you have to you introduce the legislation 1 year, and it has to actually be once it's passed the first year, it has to pass the next year again, and there has to be an intervening House election. So it basically happens in odd, or you have to do an odd year and an even year, and then it would go on to
a referendum, right? So that's like 3 years. Mm-hmm. It's a 3-year process, and a lot of things happen because we only have a one-term governor. Virginia is the last state in the United States to have a one-term governor, so you can only serve for 4 years and you're done, at least consecutively. There's opportunities to serve a second time non-consecutively.
Right.
Yeah, we're all smiling here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to say, there are, to be fair, there is not a state where the explicit right to an abortion is enshrined in a state constitution. But according to the Center for Reproductive Rights, their most recent 2019 report, there are 7 states where where access has been expanded, and there are at least 14 states where access is protected. Unfortunately, Virginia doesn't fit into either one of those. We fall into the hostile category of states where abortion access is restricted and quite severely restricted by our laws and regulations. And when you look at a map of what's, should Roe fall or should it be severely gutted, then the states surrounding Virginia are likely to lose access. Like West Virginia, where there was a constitutional amendment to say that, abortion is not explicitly not protected by the West Virginia Constitution. And the states surrounding Virginia will likely go from having abortion clinics to either having none or having many fewer. So Virginia will become that state. If we can expand access, we have the opportunity to become a state and where patients from the surrounding regions can come to obtain necessary medical care.
Well, there's a lot of states, I think, that only have one abortion clinic. I don't know the number. I'm sure you all know the number, but I think Mississippi has one, and that's how they're chipping away at it. They're trying to regulate these clinics out of existence. And again, women who are poor, who live in rural areas, and so many women who seek abortions already have children. I mean, there's such a mythology around who people think are the women, deciding when and where to have children and for what reason. But there is a large number of women who already have children, and they have their own reasons for doing this. And so to really put the burden on the women who can least afford both children that were unplanned, or to avail themselves of a service that gives them the opportunity to do better family planning. Women who have money, influence, and access will always have a choice. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about is equity issues that say, what about everybody else?
And just to let you know, there are 6 states that only have one abortion clinic, and 2 of them, in fact, border Virginia, West Virginia and Kentucky. So that's where we are located.
And I know that you all have fought the good fight with Whole Women's Health. In fact, that was the Texas case that was decided, I think, favorably. For those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. You're listening to Radio Fairfax, and tonight we're talking with some of the leadership of NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia. That would be Tarina Keene, Michelle Woods, and Galina Valchina. So to talk a little bit about Whole Women's Health, you did play a major role in that, and we thought we kind of had a decision there, but now that's the one that's in jeopardy because of the Louisiana case.
Yes,
so
I was going to say, Galina could probably talk to it about it.
Sure. NARAL, we were not a plaintiff in the case, right? The Women's Health was a plaintiff in the case. But among other abortion providers, the case came out of Texas, and it essentially they've challenged the same kinds of abortion restrictions that are present in many states across the country, where you have admitting privileges and building code requirements and other requirements that are different from those that apply to other providers that do similar medical procedures, applying to abortions. Much more strict, much more stringent, much more expansive, ones that lead to clinics being shut down, make opening new clinics very difficult. And those were challenged in the case of Women's Health, 2016. The decision came down that said, yes, those restrictions are in fact unconstitutional. And not only that, but the court also said that whenever you have restrictions that are medically unjustified and create a burden, that burden is undue. Unfortunately, the Fifth Circuit is special and does not really respect Supreme Court precedent. So when the Louisiana case, based on pretty much the same fact pattern, came up before the Fifth Circuit, the Fifth Circuit said, well, no, we're not going to. We think that our case is special, and the doctors and the providers just didn't try hard enough to get admitting privileges in hospitals, and this is a different set of facts, and therefore we think that there's no undue burden, and that has now been accepted. The Supreme Court will hear the case and then make the decision in the case by summer 2020. So we may have a significant gutting of that really helpful precedent from 2016 as soon as the summer of 2020. Another thing that's important about this particular case is that the state of Louisiana also added an additional petition or an additional ask of the court to say, hey, we also think that providers don't have standing to represent their patients in cases like this, in abortion cases, which means that there are about a dozen cases moving up towards the Supreme Court. A lot of them where providers are representing, are the plaintiffs that represent patients, and if the Supreme Court agrees with the state of Louisiana and says that providers can't represent patients in lawsuits about abortion, then you have a lot of cases going out, and that really changes how jurisprudence is done around this particular issue. So there are a lot of issues in this case that can have a significant impact on how we fight for abortion rights in the courts. And really relying on the courts, especially the Supreme Court at this point, is, we really have to look towards the state legislatures to protect these rights.
And that brings us full circle back to the original point about why in 11 days voters have a responsibility to get to the polls. And in an off-year election, the percentage drops to about 30%. Only 30% of Virginia voters in this fourth phase of our fourth-year cycle will even go to the polls to vote at all. So, Tarina, again, how are some of these key races going to impact the outcome in we're voting in 2019. What is this going to mean in 2020's legislative session?
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you right now that reproductive rights is polling as one of the top 3 issues that motivate voters to get out and vote. So over the next 11 days, that's going to be something that we're going to be talking about very clearly and very loudly because we know what's at stake. And as Galina has pointed out, that we cannot rely on the courts to protect our rights anymore. And that also, it's not just the Supreme Court, it's the lower courts. Because what we have seen happen at the federal level under President Trump is that we are seeing dozens and dozens of lower court judges being placed, that this is a litmus test for them. So no longer can we rely on the courts. The one thing that probably lets me sleep at night is knowing that we have this opportunity in Virginia to actually make change. And we're seeing a lot of motivation on the ground every day. Even though it is an off-year election, people are, they're very anti-Trump, which is one reason why they're motivated. They're also motivated. They want gun sense laws put into place, something that we've known for a long time. But they also want their health care, and they also want politicians to stay out of their reproductive health care decisions. It's something that's very important to them, bodily autonomy. So we know that going in, this is something that I think with all of our listeners is to please talk about this, a lot over the next few days as something that we can do when we get in. We have a couple of things we want to do. We need to repeal the very bad laws on the books that present barriers to women every single day in the Commonwealth. The trap laws that you actually brought up earlier that have actually shut down half a dozen clinics in the Commonwealth over the last 5 or 6 years. The mandatory ultrasound is that probably a lot of folks have remember that fight from a few years ago. It's still there. It's still on the books. 12 24-hour waiting periods that have to happen. Politicians think that you need to go home and think about these decisions, even though
You've already thought about it
you've
and
already
made a
thought about
decision.
it, right? And there are very good reasons why someone who is seeking an abortion is making that decision, and it's demeaning. It's absolutely demeaning to actually think that there's no other healthcare issue on the books that is as regulated as abortion care is.
And I think, too, it also infantilizes women to say that the government needs to help you to make a better decision by putting all these things in place so you can think about it some more. To me, that is totally degrading of women. It infantilizes women and treats us in a way we shouldn't. When we come back from the break, we're going to be talking again with NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia.
Fairfax Public Access, a 501c3 organization in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Al Cooper, Brooks Williams, Al Stewart, Cheryl Wheeler, Barlow Guthrie, Chris. Contemporary singer-songwriter folk artists side by side with long-standing esoteric rock performers. That's what Eclectic Hours is. It's music for baby boomers, music where you gotta listen to the words. Eclectic Hours, Sunday mornings from 10 a.m. to noon. James Taylor, Kate Campbell, Joe Cocker, Livingston Taylor, Lucy.
Free for Me, bringing you musical gems rarely heard on the radio. Hear the White Stripes, St. Vincent, and the Hot Melts. Free for Me, Tuesday at 5 on Radio Fairfax.
Let's go down into the subway station where you hear the strangest things. Every Saturday at 4 o'clock on Night Train Memories, Sounds of the Cities.
Want to hear what there is in jazz besides usual big names? Come listen to The Outer View, where you'll hear vocalists, pianists, jazz rock, jazz from foreign countries, and much more, going all the way from the mainstream to the cutting edge. The exploring happens on The Outer View with Jerry Howard, Tuesdays 2 to 3 on Radio Fairfax.
Tired of the same old oldies stations playing the same tracks over and over again? If you want to hear some great 50s music you probably never heard before, come and listen to my show. Colin Davies, the Professor of Rock, here on Thursdays from 4 till 6.
The radio programs aired by FPA reflect the viewpoints of individual producers and do not necessarily represent those of the station, its staff, or supporters.
Like what you hear? Like what you see? Lights, camera, action. Here's your chance to put your voice and talent to use. What are you waiting for? Your show could be the next big hit. Get involved. Attend a free orientation. Learn to create your own radio and television show. We have courses in radio and television production, post-production, and much more. Come volunteer on a show and sharpen your skills. Don't delay. Don't hesitate. Pick up the phone and call us at 571-749-1102 or visit our website www.fcac.org/orientation.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking with the leadership team of NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia. Tarina Keene, who's the executive director, Michelle Woods, the communications director, and Galina Valchina, who is the policy director. When we went to break, we were talking about the importance of these elections that are taking place in 11 days. And there are key races where there is an actual opportunity to flip the seat from red to blue to pro-choice candidates. And let's talk a little bit about these specific races and how people can help. A lot of times those of us who live here in Northern Virginia, our representatives, mine, do not have opponents. That doesn't mean you can't phone call, door knock, travel, phone bank, donate, or whatever to candidates to help them to win their race. So talk a little bit about what some of these competitive races are. Where are the opportunities here?
Oh, there are so many. I will say right now that in surrounding Fairfax, we have just south of us is HD 51, and that is incumbent Hala Ayala. She is in a tight race, but she's definitely a champion of reproductive rights and freedom. And we're working there. We have a volunteer canvas where they are 7 days a week knocking doors. We're also, we're on the airwaves of the digital airwaves, let me say that, trying to get the word out about that race. But it's very close. Some other races that are in the probably listening area, House District 31, Elizabeth Guzman. She's also one of the freshmen one of the freshman 15 that came in the wave of 2017. And she's another fabulous champion that is not only a great spokesperson for us, but she puts her votes in the right places. And that's another race that is tight. And the thing is that what we learned from 2017 is we had 15 new freshmen that came in. We from a pro-choice standpoint, advocacy standpoint, we had 49 out of 100 delegates in the House that won. But actually, there were two other races that were so close. One that was tied down in the Hampton Roads area.
Shelley Simons.
Yes. Who ran against Delegate
Photo
Nancy.
canisters, please.
Yes.
I mean, on what planet do you decide elections this way?
Yes. And it was tied, and they basically had to pull a
name out of a hat or out of a bowl.
Yes. But she is running again this year, and it's looking really good for her in that particular race. But it doesn't mean that we aren't, definitely out there knocking doors, talking about that particular race, what's at stake. That is a race that we can flip. That could give us the 50. But we think there are several other races that will actually get us over the top in terms of not just 51, but it could be 54, 55, 56. And having a solid pro-choice majority in the House of Delegates means we get the speakership. We could have a very solid advocate who is the Speaker of the House. And I can tell you, that hasn't happened in probably, I don't know the exact number, but it's about a couple of decades.
Yeah.
So this is a generational election. So that's why this is something that's very, very important, not only to our issue, but for pretty much the entire progressive agenda that we've been working with allies for many, many years now to get passed, and we are within striking distance of making that happen.
I interviewed Elizabeth Guzman, and she was talking about how Prince William is the first county in Virginia that is minority majority, which I didn't even realize that. But when they flipped Prince William County, and they flipped the seats in Prince William County, basically people of tremendous diversity took over from incumbents who were basically white men, conservative white men. And it was because it was a governor's race, and so there was a higher turnout. Mm-hmm. In this off year, the last off-year election we had was 2015, and Delegate Guzman was saying only 21% of voters came out in her district in 2015. Mm-hmm. And that is how conservative white men hang on to seats in tremendously diverse counties like Prince William. And so trying to get people to the polls when it's not a presidential year, when it's not a gubernatorial year, is so hard. But what has happened since 2015 is that Trump was elected, first of all. That's the first big change. The second big change is that we did have a wave election in 2017 that showed that these formerly would have been considered improbable candidates actually won. But now we've got the energy, the momentum, the sense of urgency to tell people in Virginia, it never stops. Every year's an election year. It's just been such a tough thing. Certainly in the pro-choice movement, it has been such a tough thing to help people to feel this sense of urgency that we are always under attack. So, Michelle, how are you trying to create this sense of urgency like we are under attack? Please come out.
Well, adding to what Tarina said about some of these races, there's some other tight state Senate races, and the problem is that some of these anti-abortion Republicans pose as moderates, right? They pretend they have these mailers that say they support women's health, but then when you look at their record, and I'm specifically right now talking about Senator Dunavant, who's in Senate District 12, running again, and she's an anti-choice OBGYN who voted against access to affordable birth control. I mean, you name it, and she had a bad vote on a women's health bill. But they run, she's running against Delegate Rodman, who is a champion of reproductive health and rights. And people like the anti-choice OBGYN, Senator Dunavant, pretend that they support women's health when in fact they do not trust a woman to make their own reproductive health care decision. So we really have to get out the message that at the end of the day, you have to really look at the records of these folks and say, how did they vote? Did they vote to defund Planned Parenthood, taking away access to affordable birth control and STI screenings that people need around the Commonwealth, especially rural people and low-income people? How did they vote on access to affordable LARCs, the LARC pilot program that the governor had put into place? And people like Senator Dunavant have every single time voted against these measures, but they need to be called out. And people need to do their homework, and they need to see that these people do not trust the women in the Commonwealth to make their own reproductive health care decisions. And we need to make sure that those people get to the polls and vote their principles and values and get these people out of office because they do not support their values at the end of the day.
I think the other thing that happened since the last fourth year cycle, which was 2015, is The Handmaid's Tale. It's interesting how, well, that's what so I'm just saying, it's interesting how cultures change and perspectives change through things like books or movies or things. People are impacted from a different perspective. For those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. You're listening to Radio Fairfax as we talk with Tarina Keene, Michelle Woods, and Galina Valchina of NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia. I do think The Handmaid's Tale is interesting in that the book is not new. The book has been around forever. But after the election of Trump, somebody decided it should be made into I think it's an HBO series. And so suddenly people who might never have read that book, never have understood this sort of dystopian future, are suddenly like, oh my goodness, like this could happen. Like I'm seeing how this could happen. Do you think, especially from a messaging standpoint, that the message that you're sending is falling on more fertile receptivity because shows like that, discussions like that, articles, books, things like that, that really show people how quickly what we take for granted as a legal right could just disappear?
Yes. And I think that we saw an example of that was it last week, earlier this week? There was a debate going on in Fairfax County with another candidate, a Republican candidate, who they were talking about gun sense laws. And there was a discussion around the Second Amendment rights, and he actually brought up, putting ankle bracelets on pregnant women. And we thought, well, that's not a very funny analogy at all. But someone had to think about that before coming up with it. And that is it's just stunning to me that we are living in a day and age where that could even be verbalized or thought about. But yes, we do live in precarious times. I will tell you right now that people do not give up power easily. And we know that there is a sense of desperation going on with the party that is now in control of the General Assembly and who has actively worked against women over their 2 decades in power. And we've seen over the last few months a dangerous disinformation campaign that has been launched against reproductive freedom and for those who advocate in favor of it, because it's out of a sense of desperation and to mislead people into believing that candidates are extremists is probably the word I want to say.
And so the really dangerous thing about that, and I always think back to the mythology of the welfare queen brought to you by Ronald Reagan in 1980, and how people cling to that to this day, that they truly believe there is such a person. It's a person of color. It's a woman of color who's a welfare queen, who's gaming the system, who just doesn't want to work. It just goes on and on and on and on. But that was such a great trope. That was such a sticky message that to this day there are people who believe that such a person exists. Not only exists, but there are so many trying to take things from the system. And this is what worries me about some of this misinformation, disinformation, and the tropes and the narratives that they're trying to weave here. Because if they gain traction, it is so hard to shake these things.
Absolutely. But the one thing that we have going for us is that 7 in 10 Virginians, actually 7 in 10 Americans, are with us. They actually, they believe that people who do not support access to reproductive health and rights, that they're weighing in to something that isn't something that they believe in. Whether they actually themselves would actually make the decision to have an abortion, they actually respect other people's rights to be able to make that personal decision that is best for themselves and their families. And they certainly don't want politicians making those decisions for women and families. So that is one thing that we definitely have going for us. And we also, while we are preparing for a post-Roe world, and I think that we have a better vision about what happens if that worst-case scenario happens, our opponents are as well. It's very different than what ours is. And theirs is to ban abortion, and we've already seen those efforts happening around the country in the last few months, and to criminalize a woman and her doctor. That is a very extreme, very dystopian, very Handmaid's Tale way of looking at the world that they want to create. And that is very different from the one that we want to create, which is to make sure that everyone has access to making decisions that are best for themselves and their families.
And speaking of politicians' visions, it seems to me there was a Pennsylvania congressman who was very anti-abortion until his mistress apparently thought she was pregnant. I just love that it was his mistress. Thought she was pregnant, and then he texted her that she needed to get an abortion. Like, that's reality. But it's conveniently forgotten. Isn't it amazing how things like that sort of hypocrisy happens in the real world and is like, poof, it's gone in the next news cycle. And people don't realize, really, do you think it was just that one politician, really, who says one thing and for the sake of expediency, believe something else?
Right. Well, unfortunately, reproductive health has become so politicized over the last few decades, and that could be further from the truth. We're talking about a medical procedure that is one of the safest medical procedures that you can access, and it's very common. It's mainstream medicine, even though unfortunately there are folks on the other side of this issue who have done their best to ostracize
and stigmatize
not only the women, but the doctors who perform abortions. So the thing is that we need to bring this back. We need to make sure that we are telling stories. Women, we are encouraging women, and we have so many that are now willing to share those stories. And but we need more of those. And we know that we can destigmatize abortion. We can take that shame away. That's how they've been able to actually control the narrative, is that we can tell those stories. And those stories are everyday stories.
Right.
Because we know that 1 in 3 women in their lifetime of reproductive age will actually have an abortion in this country.
And so many of those abortions are children that are wanted. And that's some of the stories that are starting to come out that people have not considered, that there are non-viable births, that there are births that or pregnancies that terminate. And what you're asking women to do is to carry that fetus to term naturally. For what purpose?
Right. Well, we believe, because we are pro-choice, we do believe that every woman and family will have to make decisions that are best for themselves, but some of those will be to terminate those pregnancies if they are not viable, or if a woman's health or life is also in danger. So we believe that everyone has to make those personal decisions. But that's where these decisions lie. They lie with women and their doctors and their families, not in the political realm. Politicians have no place in this decision. And we know, again, that 7 in 10 people support and believe that is the right way to go.
But we need to get those 7 in 10 people in Virginia out to the polls
yes, we
on
do.
November 5th. So, Michelle, best advice for how people can talk to their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers about the importance of this, not just on this issue. There are so many issues. For people to sit this one out, how do we create a sense of urgency? How do we get these people to the polls, Michelle? I'm looking at you.
Well, I think that, we have a great threat to a lot of our rights and a lot of our well-being at the federal level with the president and the Supreme Court. So with the increased threats to not just abortion care, but the Congress and the president doing nothing on gun sense laws, access to high-quality public education, things that the federal government does not value. I mean, the state level is where it's at. The state level is how you're going to protect those rights and the ability for yourselves and your families to prosper in a way that is not threatened by what is actually across the river from Virginia. We can protect ourselves from that scene. And it's not hard. We can get out. One Tuesday away from next Tuesday, like Tarina said, 11 days away, and we can vote 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The polls are open. Bring a form of government. 6 a.m. Thank you.
And you can also vote in-person absentee right now.
Yes.
Right now, you can go and you can vote if you're going to be out of the area, if you have a long commute for your job and you are out of the area, legitimate reason to vote in-person absentee. And so I just want to ask Galina, too, if we flip the House and the Senate, what is it going to look like for you in the legislative session in 2020? I mean, what do you think you have an opportunity to get the legislature to pass? Do you have like a top 10 list of things you really want?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have a top 30 things I really want, but the most important things are we have to repeal those bad laws that we have on the books that are restricting access. That is the first and most important thing we have to do, because right now women in Virginia and pregnant people in Virginia who are out in rural communities, they have to make 2 or 3 trips in order to have an abortion because of the 24-hour waiting period, because of the extra and medically unnecessary ultrasound. We have the trap laws on the books that, targeted regulations of abortion providers that require abortion providers or providers that provide more than 5 abortions a month to follow all of these additional restrictions that no other physician's office that performs similarly situated medical procedures has to follow. So, right, we don't have as many providers as we otherwise would. So we really need to focus on getting rid of those medically unnecessary restrictions first and foremost. And of course, we also should codify Roe, or codify the right to bodily autonomy, the right to an abortion in the Virginia Code, to make sure that going forward, that is enshrined in the code, and we make a statement that Virginia is a state, or Virginia is a Commonwealth or a state that will protect a woman's rights, will protect a person's right to make decisions about their bodily autonomy, about their reproductive health and future. So those are the most important first priorities. There's a long shopping list, but
but we have a shot at it. But the point is, we have a shot at it. And Tarina, do you think we're ever going to put the genie back in the bottle now that women have been awakened to what their power actually is?
I hope not.
I can't foresee it. I was talking to somebody the other day about how, it wasn't that long ago that, the UVA didn't allow women to enroll, like in the 1970s, which I remember the 1970s. I was there. And other institutions that were like VMI wouldn't let women in, right? But suddenly, enrollment in colleges and universities and graduate programs are majority women.
Yes, they are.
And that's
school too.
Yeah, and that's happened in a short period of time. And I look at that and I think, is there an analogy here that says now that women have been awakened after the Trump ascendancy in 2016 and discovered they can do these things? When you look at Hala Ayala and when you look at Elizabeth Guzman, who never necessarily thought they would run for office, and here they are doing the thing. And so many other women, AOC, she has flipped everyone's idea of what it means to be in Congress as a young woman and a millennial. Is this eventually going to make a difference on this issue?
Yes. And one of the things, just to bring up the fact that we have had all of these changes, there are more women in our in higher education, in the boardrooms, and we still have a long way to go. But a lot of the reason we have to remember that we are where we are, and even though we still have a ways to go, is because we have been able to, some of us have been able to control our reproductive destinies. When we were able to have birth control, and some of that didn't actually even start until the late 60s and the early 70s for single people. Married people, I think, in the 60s were able to actually access birth control, and then single women could actually have it when they were in the 70s, and then when we gained the right to abortion, that was definitely one of the ways that we were able to participate in society a little more
fully. In
other words,
our
we still have a ways to go.
but it meant that our biology was not our destiny.
Yes, and that has changed over over several decades. Roe will turn 47 in January. But never before has it been under threat as it is right now. The lower courts, the Supreme Court, they pose an existential threat to Roe. So that is why we have to prepare for a post-Roe world. It's why we are already, and the other side is as well. But it's also an opportunity. November 5th is a major opportunity for the Commonwealth of Virginia. If we flip the General Assembly this year, we will have many more women actually being elected. And we know that they will prioritize this issue. They must, because we will have 2 years to be able to get things done that we know we can get things done, with also having a governor who supports reproductive freedom as well. So if we can make this happen, we can repeal those bad laws on the books that have presented those medically unnecessary, politically motivated restrictions to health care that are on the books today. And as Galina said as well, we can codify bodily autonomy. But we have 2 years to do it. Women have waited long enough to be able to not just equality, but as you said earlier, to gain equity in society. And this will be a very big part. not only for Virginians, we have to remember that we will have people on, that are depending on us, that are on the periphery, and the boundaries.
Well, that is the best ending I can think of for this show. Thank you, Galina. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Tarina. Join us next week at 9 o'clock for Making Change Radio.